The silence around Catherine was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that arrives when history has already moved, and everyone in the room is waiting for one person to understand it. When the executors opened Elizabeth's final notes, Catherine expected guidance, perhaps a private blessing. Instead, she saw George's name written with a force that made the future feel suddenly heavier. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine did not reach for the folder at first. She stared at it as if touching the paper would make the words inside become permanent. Across from her, the senior executor gave one small nod, and that tiny movement carried more force than a public announcement. An executor is a person legally trusted to carry out someone's final instructions after death. And in that room, these officials were not simply handling paperwork. They were delivering the last private judgment of a queen who had spent her life studying duty, loyalty, weakness, and the dangerous cost of royal destiny. William watched Catherine's face change before anyone spoke again. The prince had seen her steady under pressure, seen her absorb storms with grace, seen her stand firm when the palace expected silence. But this was different. This struck their home. This reached past titles and into the life of their son. George, to the world, was the next great promise of the monarchy. To Catherine, he was still a boy whose laughter filled ordinary rooms, whose future should have unfolded slowly, not under the shadow of Elizabeth's final command. The senior executor revealed the central truth with careful words. Elizabeth's final private notes named Prince George as the chosen heir to carry the monarchy's future moral legacy. The phrase did not change the legal line of succession, which is the official order deciding who inherits the throne, but it changed something deeper. It declared where the late monarch had placed her faith. Catherine lowered her eyes to the page, and one sentence seemed to pull the air from the room. George was the one who must be prepared before the nation knows why. William shifted beside her. He understood at once that this was not ceremonial praise. This was warning. This was preparation. This was Elizabeth, reaching beyond the grave to say that George had been seen, measured, and chosen in a way even his parents had not fully understood. Then Catherine turned the second page, and the truth sharpened. The Queen had made this judgment after watching private moments inside the family, quiet moments no crowd had witnessed, and no palace statement could explain. Catherine closed the folder slowly. Her hand rested on the cover, but her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. She did not ask what this meant for the crown. She did not ask what the palace would do next. She asked what Elizabeth had seen in George that no one else had fully understood. And before Catherine could absorb what had been placed in her hands, the people closest to George were forced to confront what this revelation would cost them. For the palace, George's name meant continuity. For Catherine, it meant a son. For William, it meant destiny moving too soon. And for Charles, it meant the shadow of his mother still reaching across the reign he thought he controlled. In one room, 4 lives were pulled toward the same truth, yet each felt the wound differently. Catherine kept her hand pressed against the folder, as though she could hold back the weight inside it. The papers had already changed the air, but the silence after them felt worse. Elizabeth's notes did not speak only of monarchy. They spoke of motherhood, preparation, and the private shaping of George's future, turning one child's name into the center of a burden no parent could hear without fear. Catherine understood the honor. She felt it deeply. But honor did not soften the ache. It sharpened it, because the late queen had not simply praised George. She had placed him inside a future that now seemed to be moving toward him too quickly. William remained still beside her, but his stillness was not calm. The prince was weighing 2 duties that could not easily live together. One belonged to the institution, the ancient machine that demanded heirs, order, and steady preparation. The other belonged to his son, to the boy he wanted to protect from being swallowed by expectation before he understood its price. William looked at Catherine, and she knew he had reached the same painful truth. Elizabeth's final confidence was not only a blessing, it was a command wrapped in love. And commands from the monarch did not fade just because the monarch was gone. Charles received the revelation with controlled sadness. The king set his glasses down slowly, and that small gesture betrayed what his voice refused to admit. Elizabeth had reached past his reign and placed her deepest emotional faith in George. with Catherine named as the one trusted to preserve the boy's steadiness. A monarch may sit on the throne, but a mother's final judgment can still rule the room. Charles understood that painful difference. He was not being publicly challenged, yet privately, he felt bypassed by the woman whose approval had shaped his whole life. Then the executors explained the most unsettling detail. Elizabeth's notes had been written in stages. The Queen had watched George over time, recording quiet impressions, before deciding his name belonged at the center. This was not a sudden thought. It was not sentiment. It was a long, careful conclusion. One executor revealed that Catherine had been named directly as the person responsible for protecting George's emotional steadiness, and Catherine felt the folder become heavier beneath her hand. The more the family understood who had been named, the more one question grew unavoidable. Why George? Why now? And what had Elizabeth seen before anyone else dared to say it aloud? To understand why George's name appeared in those notes, Catherine had to look backward to the moment that quietly changed everything. There had been one day no one spoke of afterward, not because it looked dramatic from the outside, but because those who witnessed it understood something had shifted beneath the polished surface. Elizabeth had watched George during a private Windsor Chapel rehearsal, and what she saw there became the hidden trigger behind the final notes, now shaking Catherine's world. Catherine remembered that day with a pain she had not understood at the time. George had returned quieter than usual, not upset, not frightened, but changed in that strange way children sometimes change when they have sensed adult attention without fully knowing why. He had not spoken much about the rehearsal. He had simply carried himself with a carefulness that made Catherine watch him longer than she normally would. Now, with Elizabeth's final notes open before her, that memory came back with brutal force. The rehearsal had not been just another private royal arrangement. It had been the moment the Queen began to decide. The chapel rehearsal mattered because it had gathered the family's future inside a small, controlled tradition. A rehearsal, in plain terms, is a private practice before a formal ceremony, meant to prepare everyone for their role before the public ever sees it. George had been there among younger children, including one nervous page who forgot where to stand and froze under pressure. No one expected George to act. No one told him to step forward, yet he did. He quietly corrected the younger boy, steadied him, then stepped back without asking for credit or praise. Elizabeth noticed everything. The Queen had seen power in many forms: loud confidence, polished speeches, practiced royal charm. But this was different. George showed calm responsibility without performance, authority without hunger, kindness without display. In her private note, Elizabeth later called that chapel incident the first proof, a phrase that struck Catherine like a warning hidden inside a blessing. First proof meant there had been more. First proof meant the monarch had been watching her son across time, collecting signs, weighing them in silence. William felt the wound differently. The prince was not there for every second of that moment, and that absence now hurt him more than he expected. He wondered what his grandmother had seen before he did. He wondered how long George had been carrying quiet pieces of duty without anyone naming them. Catherine saw that sorrow in William, and it deepened her own fear, because both parents were suddenly facing the same truth. Elizabeth had recognized something in their child before they were ready to confront it. Then the executors disclosed the part that changed the memory into a conflict. Elizabeth had asked for George's conduct to be remembered, not publicized, because she believed the strongest heirs are formed away from applause. That private rehearsal became the emotional key, but it also raised a painful conflict. Not everyone agreed Catherine should be the guardian of George's preparation. And once that hidden memory was brought into the open, the first confrontation could no longer be avoided. The confrontation did not begin with shouting. It began with a chair moving back from the table, the scrape of wood sounding sharper than any accusation. William stood first, not as a prince performing duty, but as a father pushed to the edge. Catherine looked at him. Charles looked away, and the executors waited as the future king finally spoke. William had listened long enough. The notes had been read once, then again, and the second reading made every sentence feel heavier, as though Elizabeth's voice had entered the room and refused to leave. The private palace meeting, meant to bring clarity, had instead opened a wound inside the family. A palace executor, the person trusted to carry out the late queen's final instructions, held the pages with careful hands. But no careful handling could soften what those words had done. George's name was no longer only part of the future. It had become the center of a silent struggle in the present. Charles tried to slow the moment before it escaped him. The king asked whether Elizabeth had intended immediate action or only symbolic guidance, and his question carried more fear than authority. Symbolic guidance meant the notes could be honored with gentle language and delayed decisions. Immediate action meant the family would have to reshape George's preparation at once. Charles knew the difference, and so did everyone else. The monarch was not denying his mother's words, but he was trying to control their consequences before they took power away from him. William answered with a tightness that made Catherine turn toward him. The prince told Charles that George could not be treated like a royal asset, not like a title to be managed, or a public hope to be polished. His son had to remain a child before he became a king. The words landed hard because they were simple, and because they exposed the truth no one wanted to say. The crown could bless a life, but it could also consume it. William had lived close enough to that danger to recognize its first shadow. Catherine spoke next, shaken but steady. She said Elizabeth had trusted her not to harden George, but to keep him human. That was the heart of the notes. Not ceremony, not image, not cold preparation. A decree, meaning an official royal order or command, could shape duties, but Elizabeth's final words had created something different, an emotional authority no throne could easily erase. Then one executor confirmed the detail that changed everything. Elizabeth had written Catherine's name beside George's more than once. Not once in passing, not as a polite reference, more than once. Charles looked at the folder, and for the first time, he understood that his mother had placed trust somewhere no crown could simply overrule. The confrontation ended when Charles closed the folder himself. He said nothing, yet his silence carried a warning louder than anger, because the true power struggle had only begun. Because behind the family's grief stood a colder question: who now had the right to shape George's future? The notes were not law in the ordinary sense, yet everyone understood their force. Elizabeth had ruled long enough for her final words to carry a weight no official seal could fully measure. Catherine felt that weight as protection and pressure. Charles felt it as judgment. William felt it as a warning that the crown was already reaching for his son. The executors did not raise their voices, but every explanation deepened the danger. Elizabeth's final notes, they said, did not change the legal line of succession, the official order that decides who inherits the throne. George remained where history had already placed him. Yet the Queen had done something more personal and, in some ways, more powerful. She had set out her private wishes for how he should be prepared, and those wishes did not belong to committees, courtiers, or advisors. They belonged first to Catherine, then to William, and that single distinction unsettled the room. Catherine understood why it mattered. If George's future was handled only as a palace matter, he would be shaped by schedules, ceremonies, and public expectation before he ever had the strength to carry them. But if Elizabeth's notes were honored as written, Catherine would become the emotional guardian of that preparation. She would protect not just his image, but his steadiness. William would shield him from premature public burden, holding back the machinery that always wanted the next heir polished, presented, and prepared before childhood had finished its work. Charles felt the blow after everyone else had left. The king sat alone with one hand resting on the file, feeling the ache of a son who had become monarch, yet still could not escape his mother's final judgment. Elizabeth had not removed his authority, but she had measured it. She had trusted him with the crown, while trusting Catherine and William with the heart of its future. That difference cut deeper than any public criticism because it came from the woman whose approval he had chased for a lifetime. Catherine walked into a quiet corridor and paused before calling George. Her hand hovered near the phone, and for one painful moment, she could not decide whether to speak normally or hold back tears. How could she hear her son's voice without thinking of the note? How could she ask about his day when Elizabeth's words had already turned that ordinary life into something fragile and watched? Then the final memorandum sharpened the warning. A memorandum is a written record attached to important papers, so its meaning cannot be ignored. And this one stated that George's preparation must never be driven by image, popularity, or palace impatience. The executors revealed that Elizabeth had rejected earlier language giving broader control to palace advisors, narrowing trust toward Catherine and William instead. That narrowing sent a shock through the household, because advisors who expected influence now found themselves pushed to the edge. And when the palace machinery felt itself losing control, the first consequences began to strike with brutal speed. By morning, the atmosphere inside the palace had changed. Doors closed faster, voices lowered when Catherine passed. Aides who once spoke confidently about George's future suddenly found themselves waiting for instructions they no longer controlled. The revelation had not exploded publicly yet, but privately, it had already rearranged the balance of power. Catherine felt that shift before anyone dared explain it. The same officials who had once carried papers past her with quiet certainty now paused, waited, and watched for her reaction. Senior aides began reviewing every plan involving George, from public appearances to future ceremonial training, because Elizabeth's notes demanded restraint. Ceremonial training, in simple terms, meant the private preparation for royal duties, public rituals, and formal behavior expected of someone born close to the throne. Before this moment, those plans had moved through palace channels as if they were routine. Now they needed Catherine's approval, and that change alone told everyone that the old order had been cracked. William saw the danger immediately. A briefing paper appeared on a desk, filled with language about George's future visibility, gradual public confidence, and early symbolic readiness. The prince picked it up, read only enough to understand its meaning, then folded it once with controlled anger. He told the aide standing nearby that his son would not be scheduled like a symbol. The words were calm, but they carried a warning. George was not a project. He was not a message for the nation. He was a child, and William would not let the crown dress pressure in the language of duty. Catherine's breaking point came in a quieter way. She heard George laughing with Charlotte and Louis, and the sound nearly undid her. Charlotte teased her brother with the easy boldness of a sister who knew him only as George, not as the future hope of a monarchy. Louis chased the moment with innocent energy, unaware that adults beyond that room were already weighing his brother's life as if it belonged to history. Catherine stood still, caught between success and suffering. Elizabeth had trusted her. The palace now needed her. But the price of that trust was watching childhood become guarded ground. Then the older files revealed why the Queen had been so careful. A draft plan for George's accelerated public grooming was found among palace papers. Public grooming, meaning the managed shaping of a royal figure for national attention, had begun earlier than Catherine realized. The discovery proved Elizabeth had reason to worry. Even more painfully, Catherine learned the monarch had blocked similar pressure before her passing, meaning this battle had started long before the executors opened the notes. The fallout pushed Catherine and William toward a decision no aide could draft for them. No courtier could soften it. No official phrase could make it painless. And when the palace noise finally faded, Catherine and William faced each other not as royals, but as parents. There were no advisors in the room this time. No executors. No ancient portraits pressing judgment from the walls. Only Catherine, William, and the terrible tenderness of knowing their child had been named by history before he had finished growing up. The turning point came not through a decree, but through a promise spoken in low voices. Catherine let the silence settle, because this time, silence did not belong to the palace. It belonged to them. After the files, the whispers, the folded briefing paper, and the cold discovery that George's future had already been discussed by people who did not know the sound of his laugh, she and William chose to speak without palace staff present. Palace staff, meaning the aides and officials who manage royal schedules and private duties, had shaped enough of the conversation. This moment needed no official witness. It needed a mother and a father strong enough to name what frightened them. William admitted it first. The prince said Elizabeth's notes scared him, not because he doubted the Queen, but because he knew how early duty could enter a child's life and never fully leave. He had felt that pressure. He had grown under its shadow. He understood how praise could become a cage when the world decided a child belonged to the future more than to himself. George had been named with love, But love did not erase danger. Sometimes it made danger harder to challenge. Catherine listened, and her calmness became the force that held the room together. She said she would honor Elizabeth. She would respect the trust placed in her, but she would not let George's childhood become the price of royal preparation. The Queen had not asked her to create a polished figure. She had asked her to protect steadiness, kindness, and humanity. That difference mattered. It meant George would be guided, not pushed, prepared, not hardened, watched over, not displayed. William took Catherine's hand, and the decision formed between them, before either needed to dress it in grand words. Their son would be prepared through love first, not pressure, performance, or fear. He would not be told the full meaning of the notes immediately. Not yet. He would be guided slowly, with truth offered only when his heart was ready to carry it. That choice was not defiance. It was protection. It was the answer Elizabeth had trusted them to find. Catherine placed the notes inside a private drawer and locked it, not to hide them forever, but to protect the timing of the truth. The decision steadied the family, but outside the palace, the story was already beginning to break. By the time the public heard George's name connected to Elizabeth's final wishes, the monarchy had already chosen how it would survive the storm. The world did not receive the revelation gently. It arrived like a bell struck across Britain, sharp, emotional, impossible to ignore. By dawn, George's name stood above every conversation about the crown's future. Catherine saw the headlines first, and in that instant, she understood that her private fear had become a national image. Catherine read the palace statement before the household had fully stirred. The words were controlled, polished, and careful, but the meaning beneath them was impossible to soften. The palace confirmed that Elizabeth's final notes had expressed deep confidence in George's future and had recognized Catherine's guiding role in protecting his preparation. A palace statement, in simple terms, is the official message released to shape how the public understands a royal matter. This one avoided legal language. It did not claim a new order. It did not announce a formal change. Yet everyone understood what had happened. The late Queen had looked beyond the present reign and placed her emotional faith in a child. Catherine set the paper down before George entered. She did it quickly, almost instinctively, as though the page itself might speak his name too loudly. Her son was still moving through the morning, unaware that strangers were already discussing his destiny over tea, broadcasts, and headlines. That was the cruelty of the moment. The public felt inspired. The palace felt steadied. But Catherine felt the private cost. A mother had to hide the nation's hunger from the boy at the center of it. William stood apart, tense but resolved. The prince knew the public reaction could not be reversed now. Once George's name had been tied to Elizabeth's final wishes, the nation would never see him in quite the same way again. He would still be a child inside the family, but outside those walls, he had become a symbol of continuity, hope, and restoration. William understood the danger in that kind of love. Public affection could lift an heir, but it could also trap him before he had the strength to breathe beneath it. Then came the image that captured everything. One newspaper front page placed George beside the words, "Elizabeth's final faith," and the phrase swept through the morning like a verdict. Outside Windsor Castle gates, crowds gathered quietly, not in celebration exactly, but in recognition of a story that felt bigger than gossip. A broadcaster later framed the notes as the Queen's final emotional vote of confidence, turning private family papers into a public symbol of continuity. Yet inside the family, the reaction only confirmed what Catherine and William had already decided. George would be protected before he was presented. He would be loved before he was shaped. And when the noise finally settled, one truth remained stronger than every headline, every whisper, and every palace calculation. In the end, Elizabeth's final notes did not crown George before his time. They did something far more intimate. They named what she believed the monarchy would need after power, after grief, after scandal, after survival. Catherine understood it at last. The Queen had not handed her son a throne. She had handed the family a warning and a blessing. Catherine returned to the locked drawer one final time, and this time her hand did not tremble. The fear had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It had become purpose. Elizabeth's notes had affirmed George as the future moral hope of the monarchy, not because he was next in line, but because the Queen believed character would matter more than ceremony when the crown faced its next great test. The crown, in plain terms, means the monarchy itself, the royal authority, duty, and public trust carried by the sovereign and the family around that role. For Catherine, that meaning now rested close to home, not in grand language, but in the life of her son. William watched George playing without knowing the full storm that had moved around him. The prince saw innocence where others saw destiny, and that difference became his final answer. He accepted that protection was not weakness, it was service. It was the highest duty he could offer before his son ever stepped into history's full glare. George did not need to be hurried into greatness. He needed to be kept whole long enough to grow into it. William understood, with painful clarity, that the monarchy's survival depended not only on birth order, but on whether the next heir was allowed to remain human. Charles reached his own quiet peace with the truth. The king had first felt Elizabeth's confidence as a wound, as if his mother had looked beyond him before his reign had fully settled. But in the end, he understood the deeper mercy inside her choice. The Queen had not rejected him. She had built a bridge beyond him. She had trusted Charles to reign, while trusting Catherine and William to guard the child who would one day carry everything forward. That realization did not erase the ache, but it softened the judgment. Catherine placed her hand over the notes, and finally understood her role. Elizabeth had not asked her to harden George. She had asked her to shield him. The monarchy's quiet decision was settled. George would be prepared slowly, privately, and with Catherine as the emotional shield the late monarch had chosen. This moment meant the crown had been reminded of its deepest duty, not to preserve power at any cost, but to protect the child who would one day carry it. Elizabeth's final notes left no chaos behind, only a solemn verdict. George may inherit the crown one day, but Catherine and William would decide how his heart survived the journey.